Hey class, welcome to Module 5. We're going to be talking about joint actions, plantar movement, different types of muscle contractions, and starting to get into a little bit of biomechanics, if you will, or at least a preview of what you'll see in biomechanics as well as in your 4460 or your kinesiology structural kinese class. Before we really go too far, I want to jump back to last week where we talked a little bit in person about anatomical position. And the reason why we want to talk about anatomical position is it's going to apply to our planar types of movement as well as specifically referring to our joint actions. So it'll give us essentially an even playing field from which we're going to be basing all of our discussions off of. So if you'll look, anatomical position is standing upright, feet close together, hands out to the side with the palms facing forward. When you're using anatomical position, you can actually go through and start applying some directional terminology. And what I want you to think about is this is essentially using terms to act like a guidance, terms to act like GPS coordinates, or ways that we can use a similar language or similar lingo in order to make sure we're all talking about the same exact part of the body in the way that the body is orienting specifically. So if you look here, the main ones I want you guys to know for this class specifically is superior, which means above or higher than, inferior, which means below or lower than, proximal means closer to the midline, distal means further from the midline or further out on the appendage. You're going to have anterior, which means towards the front, and then posterior, which means towards the back. So now that we have a little bit of anatomical position covered, let's talk about planes of motion. And what I want you to think about is that planes are essentially imaginary lines that are going to be drawn through the body, or two-dimensional surfaces that are going to be drawn through the body in order to direct the reader or to direct the conversation in a very specific manner. So we're going to be using planes to describe specific joint actions, specific muscle movements, as well as specific movement terminology. So there's actually 3 primary cardinal planes, and then these can be subdivided further and combined to make diagonal planes. But the 3 cardinal planes are going to be our frontal plane, our sagittal plane, and our transverse plane. So if you look at this image, you can see that the frontal plane is essentially dividing the body into a front and a back. So it's running through the midline of the body, dividing us into front and back. Sorry, that was my coffee cup. Our sagittal plane is going to be dividing our body into 2 separate sides, so a right and a left side. So sagittal plane is going to run essentially through the nose and through the back of the body, dividing us into that right and left side. Then we're going to have a transverse plane, which is essentially going to be like a cross section. It's going to be cutting across the body. So frontal plane, front and back, sagittal plane, side to side. Transverse is going to be cutting us into a top and a bottom, or a superior and inferior. When we start talking about movements within these specific planes, what I want you guys to think about is that a frontal plane movement is going to occur within this plane. And that sounds really goofy, but what I want you to imagine is that this arm is coming up and out to the side while staying in this plane. So it's staying within that line. Same thing with the leg. It would be like moving the ankle out and back within that plane of motion, within that directionality of motion in which the two-dimensional plane is actually running through the body. So that would mean that a frontal plane movement would actually be occurring out to the sides. A sagittal plane movement would be occurring in the direction of this plane here as well. So that means that as the palm rotates forward, as you flex your bicep, you're actually going to be moving in a sagittal plane. Same thing with flexion extension of the head. As you move the head forward and backward, you're going to actually be moving in the sagittal plane, so in this front to back motion. In the transverse plane, we're going to have the exact same thing again, right? We're going to actually be moving about this two-dimensional planar structure, this two-dimensional line or surface, if you will. So that would be these rotating movements are actually occurring within a transverse or a horizontal plane. So we'll go over a couple of movements to get you guys, or at least show you guys a couple of pictures of some movements to get you oriented to what these frontal plane and sagittal plane and transverse plane movements really look like. So here you go. Perfect example is side lateral raises inside of the gym. So you pick up a set of dumbbells and you raise those dumbbells out and up to the sides, working your deltoids and your trapezius and everything. But you're going to be moving within the frontal plane because you're pushing those dumbbells out and those arms up within the frontal plane, or in that two-dimensional line that's running through here, right? Sagittal plane, forward and backward based movements. So think running is going to be occurring in the sagittal plane because we're moving within this line here. Same thing with squatting. Everything is moving within the sagittal plane. So all of the flexions, all of the extensions are going to be occurring within the sagittal plane. And there are transverse plane movements. These are going to be rotation movements, right? So if we think and we go back to this transverse plane and it's cutting across the body here, we're going to need to have a rotation of the body occurring in order to be achieving a movement in line with that two-dimensional plane. So one way that you can think about this is as you stroll through the doorway, as you're walking through the doorway, you're actually moving in a sagittal plane because you're moving forward and backwards. When you reach the door frame, you lean up against either side of the door frame. F frame, frontal plane. And then as you try and close the door, you're going to be moving in the transverse plane. So now that we have a general concept of how planar motion's occurring, let's talk about muscle contractions. So the word contraction can actually be a bit of a misnomer, and it can be a little bit confusing because you want to think that a contraction means that the muscle is actually shortening. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the case because we can have muscle contractions where there is no net movement or change in the muscle, as well as we can have contractions where the muscle is being lengthened. So essentially, when a contraction is occurring, it's just whenever tension is being developed inside of the muscle. So what I want you to do is take and put your hand on your bicep, and I want you to flex your bicep hard. You feel how you can still feel tension whether or not you have a movement of your elbow or not. It's the exact reason why contraction is a bit of a strange term, because you're still exerting tension, but you're not necessarily having a change in displacement of the joint itself. So there's several different types of muscle contractions. Obviously, we're going to have a muscle contraction for basically every type of movement that's going to be occurring. So we want to use muscles to control either an initiation of a movement, to control the movement, or to actually prevent joint movement. So we actually use our muscles to protect our joints by controlling net joint movement. We use our muscles to slow down or decelerate movements that are occurring at high speeds. And we also use our muscles to initiate movement. So think a great example of this is going to be a baseball pitcher. Think about how much motion and how much torque is going through the body as a baseball pitcher is throwing that ball. If we did not have muscles to control or prevent joint movement, that baseball pitcher would throw his arm out of his socket probably every single time he's throwing that ball. So you just need to think that there's more than just a shortening of the muscle that's occurring. So let's start talking about these types of contractions, right? The first one we're going to talk about is going to be an isometric contraction. And rather than paying attention to all the words over here on the right-hand side, what I want you to do is pay attention to these pictures for me. So you can see that you have a 10 kilogram resistance that's being applied to the upper arm, and the individual's trying to go through a curling motion with that. However, there's actually a contraction occurring without a net shortening of the bicep occurring. So there's a force being applied because the individual is fighting the weight, but there's no net shortening that's going to be occurring. If we go down to the flip side, because of this pulley, It makes it like a tricep push down exercise in the gym. We have the same resistance level, and you can see that there's active tension being developed. That's why it's swollen, right? There's active tension being developed by this triceps muscle. However, there's no net movement that's occurring. So despite the fact that force is being applied and tension is being developed, there's no shortening or lengthening of the muscle that's occurring. There's no changing of joint angle that's occurring. Thus, it's an isometric contraction. Now, let's talk concentric contractions. Same pictures, only thing that's different is going to be these movement arrows. So because the force that's being applied by the bicep is actually able to overcome the resistance of the 10 kilogram mass, we're going to have a net movement or rotation of the elbow joint, or a flexion of the elbow joint, in order to actually cause movement. If you look down on the bottom, you're going to have a contraction of the tricep. You're going to actually have a movement of the forearm, as denoted by that arrow, and you will actually have an extension that occurs at the elbow joint. These are concentric contractions because the biceps in the top photo and the triceps in the bottom photo are actually shortening. So concentric contractions occur when the muscle shortens and the resistance, the amount of force developed by the muscle is able to overcome the resistance of the outside force. Now, eccentric contractions are essentially the opposite of concentric contractions. So this is where the muscle itself is actually lengthening. You can see with this arrow right here that the muscle is actually lengthening. And here you can see that the 10 kilogram weight is actually exceeding the amount of force that is occurring about the forearm and allowing for a net movement to occur. A lot of times we're going to be using these eccentric or these lengthening contractions to actually control the descent of resistance. So I want you to think negatives. How many of you have ever been like sitting on the preacher curl machine and you have somebody loading up weight for you and just controlling the skid down? You're controlling the weight on the way down, or this negative. That's an eccentric contraction. And you can do the same thing on the opposite side of the elbow with the tricep. Let's get into some of these muscle actions or these joint movements specifically. So I apologize for the really dumb picture, but I was able to be consecutive or consistent with the model for these photos. So let's go through these. So abduction means a lateral movement away from anatomical position in a lateral plane. So what you can see here is that abduction is occurring about this shoulder joint right here. The individual has actually brought the arm away from the body and up in the frontal plane. Down here you can see a hip abduction occurring because the leg is being lifted away from the midline and in the frontal plane. Adduction is the opposite of abduction. So it's what's occurring on the contralateral side here. You can see that the individual has brought the forearm and the arm back closer to the body and are actually lowering that arm back towards the midline. So this would be adduction, adding the limb, adding the appendage back to the body. Abduction, away from the body, AB, away from the body. Adduction is adding it back to the body. Now flexion is going to be a decreasing of a joint angle. So if you were to have this forearm straight, it would be a 180-degree joint angle because it would be a straight line. As we move that forearm towards the upper arm, it's going to be decreasing the joint angle, and you can see she's in approximately a 90-degree level here, 90-degree angle. That would be flexion because she has reduced that joint angle. Same thing is occurring with the hip, same thing is occurring with the knee. So this is elbow flexion, hip flexion, knee flexion. Extension is going to be the opposite. So you can see that she has straightened out that arm, extension. She actually expanded the joint angle, extended the joint angle, made the joint angle bigger. She's putting her shoulder into an extension position as well. This leg, because it's straightened out, is in an extension position. Same with the knee. So you see how it's kind of the opposite of the flexion position. It's actually going to be increasing the joint angle. External rotation is going to be a rotational movement around a longitudinal axis. So think transverse plane movement with an outward rotation. Imagine standing here, right? I'm externally rotating my arm. Internal rotation, complete opposite, right? So we're bringing in. Now things get a little bit goofy when you get down to the ankle because both directions are technically going to be a flexion. So a dorsiflexion is going to be a movement of the ankle that actually pulls the top of the foot closer to the shin, whereas plantar flexion is going to be moving the bottom of the foot closer to the calf. So it's going to be this would be dorsiflexion. Plantar flexion would be like standing up on your tippy toes. Pronation, a great example is rotating that forearm so that your radius is coming over your ulna, so that your palm's down. Supination is the opposite, with palms up. Okay, so we just went over how your different movements are going to be adjusting joint angles. There's different plantar movements, and I realize this came at you like 100 miles an hour, but what I want you guys to think about is that there has to also be instruments for how we're going to be anatomically measuring that neck joint movement. We do this with something called a goniometer. This is an example of a very basic goniometer, but essentially all you do is you place this axis at the point of rotation, at the point of movement. So if it's an elbow or the knee, as you can see in the picture, and then you have the individual go through the movement. So they would either be rotating this knee out or extending it because they'd be increasing the joint ankle, or you can have them pull their heel closer to their butt, which would be decreasing the joint angle or going through flexion. So if you can imagine drawing lines through the joints and drawing vectors through the joints, it'll help you understand whether or not flexion or extension is occurring.